Hi, everyone, and welcome to Night School. I'm Lynn.
And I'm Christina.
And we're part of the Nightlife team at Cal Academy in San Francisco. On Thursday nights, you would usually find us at the museum for nightlife, where we're mixing up some science, live music, creatures, and cocktails. But while we're closed, we're bringing nightlife to you at home with Night School. We'll explore a new theme every week, and this week we're diving into the study of humanity, aka anthropology.
Yes, and so to kick off the night, we have Cheryl Tripathi from the Anthropology department. She's a curatorial assistant. She's going to kick off the night with a peek into the Academy's anthropology collections, showing off some research specimens that will help illustrate the different fields of anthropology we'll learn about tonight. Dr. Todd Braje is going to share a top 10 or so list of California's most exciting and incredible archaeological finds, which speak to the deep history and amazing adaptations of its indigenous inhabitants for over the last 10,000 or so years. Learn how anthropologists read the human skeleton with Dr. Nikki Slovak as she dives into the field of bioarchaeology. And then finally, we have Dr. Jonathan Rosa here, who will introduce the field of sociocultural and linguistic anthropology and explore how language can play a central role in social justice efforts. There are a lot of syllables in all of these subdisciplines.
You did good. And as always, tonight's program is live, so say hi, let us know where you're watching from. If it's your first time, shout out to our night school regulars. We'll have Q&As with everyone, so make sure to get your questions in the chat. And with that, we'll kick it off to Cheryl.
All right. Hey, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the study of humanity. I'm going to start off the evening with a brief introduction to the field of anthropology, kind of an Anthro 101, if you will. But before I do that, I did want to share a land acknowledgement to recognize Indigenous stewardship of the land on which the Academy was built. Many Indigenous nations and governments follow this protocol before any gatherings to connect with the world around them. So if you know whose native land you are joining us from, please feel free to share in the chat. And if you are joining us from California, you can look that up by visiting nativeland.ca, and I will share that link in the chat in just a minute. So I would like to acknowledge that the California Academy of Sciences sits on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Ohlone people. We recognize that this land was and continues to be of great importance to the Ohlone and their descendants, and we pay our respects to our Indigenous community members who care for this region. We recognize that every member of the Academy community, past, present, and future, benefit from the use and occupation of this land, and that we have a responsibility to uphold and respect Indigenous solidarity and traditional ecological knowledge. So I would like to start off with just a super basic introduction to anthropology. I'm sure that some of you joining us are familiar with the field, but for those of you that aren't, what is anthropology? And essentially, anthropology is the science of humans. And that's a pretty broad field. It encompasses a lot and a lot of subdisciplines. But it's typically broken up, anthropology is typically broken up into 4 main subfields. And those are archaeology, biological anthropology, cultural anthropology, and linguistics. Now, archaeology might be the subfield that most of you, or some of you, are most familiar with. It might be kind of what you picture when you hear anthropology. And essentially, archaeologists study human activity through the excavation of sites and the recovery and analysis of material and physical remains. So archaeology can actually be broken into its own subfields depending on what kind of remains are being analyzed. So there are archaeologists who focus on cultural artifacts such as ceramics, tools, monuments, buildings, and things like that. But there are also bioarchaeologists who study skeletal or fossilized skeletal materials. And then there's the subfield of biological anthropology. And biological anthropologists study the biology of modern humans, but also are closely related non-human primates. So chimps, gorillas, lemurs, tarsiers, really all members of the primate order, as well as our extinct hominin ancestors. And we're going to learn a little bit more about that later. So biological anthropologists analyze skeletal remains in order to understand behavior and activity patterns in species, and also to identify trauma and pathology in individuals. So biological anthropologists can range from paleoanthropologists who study fossilized skeletal remains in the evolutionary record to forensic anthropologists who study recent human remains. And then cultural anthropologists study culture, which again is a really big, broad term. But essentially, culture is a system of beliefs, behaviors, and organizations that a group of people live by. So that can include economic, religious, and social structures. And cultural anthropologists study cultural variation and the diversity of human ecology. So the relationship between humans and their natural, social, and built environments. And then linguistic anthropologists study language. They study the evolution and the variation of written and spoken language across all human cultures. And they analyze how language shapes communication and plays a role in social identity, group membership, and establishing cultural beliefs and ideologies. So next we are going to take a look at a specimen tour that I pre-recorded in our anthropology lab. I wanted to give you all a look, kind of a backstage look or a behind the scenes look into our amazing anthropology collection. So that's what we're going to take a look at next. And I will be available in the chat to answer any questions. So if you have any questions during the specimen tour, feel free to post them and I will try to answer as many as possible.
All right, welcome to the Anthropology Lab here at the Academy of Sciences. So we are going to be digging into our research collection to learn more about the different fields of anthropology, including biological anthropology, archaeology, and cultural anthropology. And we're going to start with some pieces from our paleoanthropology cast collection to learn a little bit more about what biological anthropologists do. So here we have our first 3 specimens. Biological anthropologists study not only the biology of modern humans, but also the biology, anatomy, and morphology of non-human primates, as well as hominins. So hominins are essentially extinct human ancestors or closely related human ancestors. Now that's going to include extinct members of the Homo genus, such as Homo habilis, Homo erectus, and Homo neanderthalensis. And it's also going to include members of closely related genera, such as Australopithecus, Paranthropus, and Ardipithecus. And we are going to look at a key change in anatomy that told paleoanthropologists that a really important behavioral shift was happening in the evolutionary record. So let's get started. So like I said, first we have a chimpanzee skull from the Ornithology and Mammalogy collection. And then we have a Paranthropus boisei skull. So a hominin, a paleoanthropology hominin cast. Now, it's a cast because you'll notice that this is not an actual fossil skull. Paleoanthropology fossil remains are incredibly rare. Paleoanthropology means really, really old anthropology. So looking at skeletal remains, fossilized skeletal remains that are millions of years old. So we just don't have that many of them. And the ones that we do have are kept in the countries of origin. So that means that not everyone gets access to the original fossil remains, which is good. We want to keep them protected. So instead of being able to study the actual fossilized remains, what happens is paleoanthropologists, for the most part, get to look at these cast specimens. And so these are reproductions of the actual fossil remains. And you'll notice that there's a color difference in this cast specimen, and that's just based on the actual skeletal remains that were recovered, which you'll see here in gray. And then the black area is just spaces that were reconstructed. So this individual, Paranthropus boisei, lived about 2.3 to 1.2 million years ago in East Africa. This individual specimen is called OH5. We write all the specimen names on the cranium. I don't know if you can see it, but it's right there. It's kind of small. So the OH stands for Olduvai hominin, which tells us where the original fossil remains were recovered. So Olduvai Gorge is a very important paleoanthropology site in Africa. So this specimen is an Olduvai hominin, and 5 just refers to the specimen number that was recovered at the time. Now, this specimen, like I said, is a modern, anatomically modern Homo sapien. And I say modern, but it is about 11,000 years old. But anatomically modern humans evolved about 300,000 years ago. So this is actually pretty recent in evolutionary time. Now, specimen is named KNM-NJ5. Might be able to see that one a little bit better. And that is going to stand for Kenya National Museum, which is the place where the original fossil specimens were processed and where they're housed. And the NJ stands for Njoro River Cave, which is the site in Africa where the fossil specimens were recovered. And again, 5, just the specimen number. So we are going to look at a key skeletal element in all 3 of these individuals that told paleoanthropologists that a really big shift was happening in the evolutionary record. And that skeletal element is the foramen magnum. So the foramen magnum is this large opening in the base of the cranium that allows the brain stem to exit the cranium and become continuous with the spinal cord. Now, all of these individuals have a foramen magnum. This is the chimp. Here is Paranthropus. And here is Homo sapien. But you'll notice that there's a little bit of a difference in the location of the foramen magnum, especially between the chimp and the Homo sapien. With chimps and with other quadrupedal animals, quadruped just means that these animals walk on 4 legs as opposed to 2. The foramen magnum is going to have what we call a posterior position, which means it's placed towards the back of the cranium. And if I hold it this way, very carefully, you'll notice that the placement is really far back in the skull, so posterior. Now, if we look at the Homo sapien, you might notice that the foramen magnum has migrated a little bit. And in humans, the foramen magnum has what we call an inferior position, which means that rather than be located at the back or posterior portion of the cranium, it's located essentially directly underneath. I totally just blocked that. It's located directly underneath. So it's located right here. And you can't really see that based on how I'm holding it. But it's a pretty significant shift. And that shift told paleoanthropologists that these individuals were practicing different kinds of locomotion. So with the chimp and other quadrupedal animals, that foramen magnum is located posteriorly. Homo sapiens, or bipeds, we walk on 2 legs, and our foramen magnum is located inferiorly. And if we look at Paranthropus, it has kind of an intermediate position. So it's not as far back, it's not as posterior as in the chimp, but it's not quite inferior yet. So that tells us that these individuals were starting to locomote bipedally, but that they weren't what we call obligate bipeds yet. Humans are obligate bipeds, which just means that we can't walk efficiently any other way. We can walk on 4 legs, but we're not very good at it. So this individual might not have been an obligate biped, but they were definitely walking on 2 legs more so than other early primates. All right, so that shift in locomotion, the shift from quadrupedalism to bipedalism changed a lot of things in the evolutionary record for humans. And one of those things that changed was the ability to utilize our hands more. So if we're not walking on all 4 legs or all 4 limbs, that frees up our hands. And that coincided with stone tool technology. So stone tool technology has been around for about 3 million years. So it has a very long history. Stone tool technology is a very common remain that archaeologists find at sites. So for our archaeological specimens, we are going to look at some stone tools. All right. So archaeologists have been finding stone tool remains alongside human remains for millions of years, or not for millions of years, but going back millions of years. These stone tool specimens are not quite as old. They are prehistoric though, so they are a really good example of early stone tool technology. Essentially, archaeologists look at material remains of human habitation and human occupation. So stone tools are one of the earliest examples of that. They're one of the early examples of culture, one of the earliest examples of human behavior. And so these are really great specimens to look at for archaeology. So we are going to start with this piece here. Now, all of these pieces come from the same site in Africa, the Irongo Mountains. That's a volcanic mountain range. For early stone tool technology, volcanic stone material is really important because it fractures really easily. So things like quartz, flint, chert, obsidian, those are all really important resources for flint knapping, which is essentially lithic reduction. And that's the earliest form of stone tool technology, where you're basically using one rock to chip away at another rock to create tools. So here we have what we call a lithic core. Now, this lithic core would have been worked by a larger tool known as a hammerstone. And when I say worked, I just mean that it would have been chipped away at by another stone. So you can see this lithic core has been worked on all faces so that little flakes or large flakes could then be fashioned into stone tools. Now, this might not look like much, but this actually would have been an important tool in and of itself because it would allow early humans to do things like crush animal long bones and access bone marrow. And that was a really important development in human evolution because bone marrow is incredibly nutrient dense. And whereas early humans might not be able to compete for animal resources with higher level predators, a tool like this would have allowed early humans to go in and take advantage of an animal carcass that would have already been utilized by other animals and use this to crush into long bones to get access to that really important nutrient resource of bone marrow. So very basic lithic core right here. Now, from the lithic core, you would get lithic flakes. And lithic flakes could then be further worked by a secondary tool to create either a uniface or a biface. And this is a uniface. And it's called a uniface because it's only worked on one edge or one face. Hopefully you can see this edge and this edge are more blunt, and this edge has been chipped away to create kind of a sharp cutting or scraping edge. And that's what this tool would have been known as. It would have been known as a scraper. Is it better if I hold it there? Probably. Now, an advancement on that flake technology can be seen here. So this, trying to hold it up against the dark background so it's easier to see. This is known as a biface. And it's very similar in technology and methodology to the uniface, except it's been worked on two sides or two faces to create an apex or a point. And you can't really see the point. It's eroded away or might have been broken off in something. But hopefully what you can see is the notching down here at the distal end. So that notching would have allowed it to be lashed to an arrow or a spearhead And then this could be a projectile point. So a little crash course in stone tool technology right there. Again, one of the most common material remains that archaeologists find at sites. So these are all Mayan ceramics from the Academy's ethnographic collection. Now, cultural anthropologists study, obviously, culture, but more so they study how humans understand and interact and utilize their environment. These pieces are some of the oldest pieces in our research collection. They all range from about 1200 to 700 years old. Unfortunately, we don't have more specific data than that. We don't have data, level data from the site that they were collected at, because a lot of that original documentation was lost during the earthquake and fire of 1906. So all of these pieces were part of the Academy's collection prior to the 1906 earthquake. So unfortunately, a lot of that was lost, but based on the information we do still have, we can say that they are between 1200 and 700 years old, based on the site information that we have. Now, because they were with us before the fire and the earthquake, they are a little bit damaged, some more so than others, but they still tell us quite a bit about Mayan culture. So first we have our glyph bowl. Now I'm going to very carefully turn this and hold it up. Hopefully you can see. The decorative elements on this bowl are pictographs and glyph symbols. You'll notice it has been reconstructed. This was unfortunately one of the pieces that was damaged in the fire and the earthquake, especially this piece. You can see the color difference where it met the fire. But this piece is incredibly important because not only does it give us some insight into Mayan life based on those pictographs, those representations of daily life. There's one good one you can see. Hopefully you can see it here. You can see the face, an ear spool, but also it gives us some insight into the Mayan writing system. So I'm going to turn it again. Hopefully you can see it better. There we go. So right here is an example of a Mayan glyph. So the Mayan system of writing consisted of both pictographs, like we saw on here, so picture representations of objects, animals, and people, but also these glyphs that represented syllables. So unfortunately, most of the Mayan books or codices that contained their written language were destroyed due to Spanish colonization. So pieces like this that have evidence of that original Mayan system of writing are incredibly important. And so not only do they tell us about Mayan culture based on those pictographs, but they also tell us about their language system, which of course is linguistic anthropology. So linguistic anthropology and cultural anthropology in one beautiful piece. Now, next up, we have our toad effigy rattle. So this is one of my favorite pieces in our collection. This toad rattle, our theory goes that this toad rattle, and I say rattle because if I shake it really gently, you can hear a nice rattle sound. So there is a native species of toad to the region in Guatemala that these pieces were found. I believe it's called the cane toad. This native species of toad only breeds at the onset of the wet, rainy season. And so the theory is that this toad rattle is meant to emulate the mating call or the croaking that the Mayans would hear at the start of that breeding season, which coincided with the rainy season. So if you had this frog effigy rattle, you could emulate the breeding call and then essentially call the rains. So like I said, one of my favorite pieces in our collection. And finally, we have what we affectionately refer to as the squid pot. So we are not 100% sure that this is supposed to represent a squid, but based on the size and shape and the lovely tentacle decorations, that is what we refer to it as. So this vessel is a cooking vessel. So a Mayan cooking vessel that essentially allowed them to hold food at a distance. I'm going to step back so you can see. Hold food at a distance over the fire to cook it. And so the shape of this tells us that they most likely would have been using individual vessels for individual foods. So one kind of food would go in here, and then you would have multiple other vessels of the same type and hold them all over the fire at the same time to cook. All right, so that was our crash course in anthropology, digging into our anthropology collection here at the Academy of Sciences. We have many, many more amazing pieces, and I wish I could show you all of them, but hopefully that gives you a good idea about some of the pieces in our collection.
Thanks so much, Cheryl. Up next, we have Dr. Todd Braje, who's going to share some of California's most exciting archaeological finds.
All right, thank you. Thanks everyone for being here. I know it's late, and I'm thrilled to be here. The California Academy of Science is a really special place to me, and I'm really excited to participate. I'm an archaeologist at San Diego State University, and so I'm going to talk a little bit about the archaeology of California, but I'm sure you're all aware, many of you probably live in California or have visited, and you're all aware of the incredible ecological and biological diversity of our state. And, from redwood forests to the coasts. And once the Academy opens up again, you can get an amazing view of this ecological diversity in the Giants of Land and Sea exhibit, mountain ranges, deserts, and just this incredible diversity, natural diversity in our state. And in fact, California is a biodiversity hotspot, one of the few biodiversity hotspots in the world. But California also has a very deep and rich cultural history. In fact, when Europeans first arrived to California, there were somewhere on the order of 80 to 100 indigenous languages spoken in California in different cultural groups, all sort of perfectly adapted to these diverse landscapes throughout the state. And many of you probably are aware of the California icons that kind of represent our state. I'm sure you're aware of at least one of these, right? So the state bird of California, the California quail, the state flower, the California poppy, the marine fish, the Garibaldi, and then of course, we're all aware of these beautiful redwoods of our of Northern California. But I'm proud to say that California also celebrates this deep and rich cultural history as being the first state to adopt a state artifact. And here it is. This is a chipped stone bear that dates to somewhere on the order of 7,000 to 8,000 years ago. And you can see it's a metavolcanic stone tool chipped into the state or into the shape of a bear. And, it's about 2.5 inches long, 1.5 inch wide. So, it's blown up on the screen here, but a fairly small artifact. This was found in Carlsbad, California in San Diego County in 1985. And it became the state artifact of California in 1991, the first state to adopt a state artifact. And so what is this, right? I mean, it's certainly a very beautiful and representative artifact. And in fact, it's a fairly unique artifact in California. It's part of an artifact called chipstone crescents in California. And most crescents are sort of they're not shaped like animals, right? They're not shaped like animal effigies. Rather, they're sort of concentric, moon-shaped artifacts. And here are some examples. Many with sort of two projections, others with multiple projections off of them. And what these artifacts, there's a lot of arguments among archaeologists about what these are, but we've sort of settled on the idea that they are most likely transverse projectile points hafted onto a shaft in this way, sort of in a transverse fashion, in the way you might not think. And they're actually found all over California, all over the American West, and they date usually to the earliest part of the modern geologic epoch. It's called the Holocene, so the early Holocene, so up to about 8,000 years ago. Most date between about 11,000 to 8,000 years ago. And they were found, they're most commonly found associated with freshwater, like inland lakes and what we call pluvial lakes. And these lakes that formed as the world was warming, as we were coming out of the last glacial event. We transitioned from the Pleistocene, the Ice Age epoch, to the Holocene about 11,700 years ago. As glaciers retreated, they deposited water throughout much of the now arid American West in places like the Great Basin. And people would congregate and use these crescents, we believe, to hunt birds. They're also found up and down in coastal California and on the California Channel Islands, probably associated with marine bird hunting and estuaries, right? So why the state artifact of California is shaped as a bear is hard to say. It might be one of these crescents taken and sort of ritualized into sort of an animal shape. And so it's part of this technology. It might not have been functional, but rather serve some sort of other symbolic function for people. So again, the state artifact sort of shows this deep and rich history that goes back at least 10,000 years and more than 10,000 years in California. All right, so I want to now sort of take you through a couple of highlights as I see them throughout California and sort of highlight some ways that we celebrate the past and present cultural history of California. So I want to take you to the farthest sort of corner of the state, as far away as I can from San Francisco, and sort of highlight one place that I think is just absolutely amazing. So this is in southeastern California. If you get in your car from San Diego and head directly east, before you hit the border with Arizona, you'll end up in this vast desert, Colorado desert environment. And at one time, just highlighting how much our state has changed over the last 10,000 years. At one time, this area was quite wet and lush, and it contained the largest Holocene lake in North America, larger than any of the Great Lakes. This was what we've referred to as ancient Lake Cahuilla. It was 100 kilometers long, 50 kilometers wide. It covered 5,500 square miles, and it formed about 1,000 years ago when the Colorado River sort of naturally diverted from its normal course, draining in the Gulf of California, diverted over to a structural lowland called the Salton Trough. and started to fill up this lowland with fresh water. And it would do this periodically, right? And so this vast desert, as you see it today, this is the Salton Trough today, or part of it, filled up with this fresh water that spanned much of Southern California all the way into Baja, Mexico. Pretty incredible, right? And so when it would do that, it did that over about 6 intervals. It would fill, expand out and become sort of its maximum length. And then the Colorado River would divert again, drain into the Gulf of California, and the river would, or the Lake Coahuila would also start to drain into the Gulf of California. And it would slowly evaporate and sort of drain out and shrink in size until it was filled again. So Native American communities, including the Kumeyaay, the Cahuilla, and the Kokopah, were 3 ethno-historic linguistic groups that took advantage of the forming of this lake and set up seasonal camps, probably during the coolest, wettest months of the year in winter and fall, and would do things like hunt birds, terrestrial game, gather plants, and create fish traps out of local rock cobbles. So you can see one here. They're often V or U or J shaped. They would have an opening at the end where a native basket would be attached, and they would capture a variety of freshwater fish into these baskets and sort of harvest them as a really productive landscape about 1,000 years ago. And so one of the things that, you often probably think of archaeologists using toothpicks and dental picks and digging very slowly and digging square holes. And we do that. We do that often, but we also use sort of new and emerging technologies to document evidence of the past. So one of the things that we've done in this area, there are hundreds of these stone fish traps that are very hard to see on this now desert landscape. And we've mapped them using drone technology. So here's one location we've done this where there's been 55 stone fish traps mapped with this drone technology. Really incredible stuff. And we can look at their formation along recessional shorelines as Lake Cahuilla filled and then drained, and people would build and reconstruct fish traps to take advantage of those changing shorelines. And then what we found is what they were doing was creating all these fish traps along a single shoreline level, right, elevational level, and would do this over multiple shorelines as it filled and drained, and then sort of herding fish or scaring fish using their physiological responses to sort of fright to herd them into these fish traps and ultimately these fish nets. Just a really amazing story of adaptation by indigenous Californians to sort of changing California environments. All right, so let's head back up to San Francisco and talk a little bit about the archaeological record and where the Academy is at. So one of the things that you may not be aware of is there's this rich cultural history in the Bay Area. And in fact, when the Bay formed about 6,000 years ago after rising sea levels slowed, and the modern Golden Gate Bridge and San Francisco Bay, San Francisco Bay of the Golden Gate Bridge formed, there were Native American communities living all along this area. And one of the adaptations to living in this bay environment were constructing these massive shell mounds starting at least 4,000 years ago, probably longer ago. But shell mounds are basically these refuse piles of people living on bay clams and oysters and other shellfish, hunting animals, and depositing this stuff in massive trash heaps that would build up over time. In 1902, two archaeologists, Max Yule and Nels Nelson, identified 425 of these shell mounds. Many of them were just absolutely massive in time. More recently, another, the 800 or so shell mounds have been added to this inventory, the largest of which was found in Emeryville. And here is a picture in 1907 of this massive shell mound. Here it is right here. The top was shaved off in the late 1800s as a dance floor, sort of a carnival amusement area was built around it. And then in 1907, Nelson and colleagues at Berkeley excavated Emeryville shell mound, along with a number of other shell mounds around the San Francisco Bay Area. Unfortunately, the Emeryville shell mound was destroyed in 1924 to make way for an industrial paint factory. A total of 700 burials were found at the time. So these were not just trash deposits. They were living surfaces. They were places where ceremonies were performed. And they were places, special important places where the dead were interred. And so when you drive around the Bay Area and you see roads like Shell Mound, it harkens back to this deep history of indigenous people in the Bay Area. And in fact, there's been movements recently. Now the Emeryville Shell Mound in the 1990s, early 2000s was redeveloped into a commercial center, and the shell mound, the base of the shell mound is underneath that. And there's been this movement to sort of celebrate the Ohlone ancestors and their history in the construction of these shell mounds. And there's been a proposed monument to build one of these symbolic shell mounds in West Berkeley. This is the location of the oldest known shell mound. It's at 1900 4th Street in a green space. And so there's this movement to really celebrate this cultural history as we do with this natural history. All right, so I'm running a little short, but I'll just move us right up the coast to Eureka and Humboldt County. And I just want to give another example of how California is really looking backwards and celebrating this history, and doing so by connecting with indigenous peoples today. So this is Indian Island, or Duluwat Island. It was a village site and an important settlement for the Wiyot tribe for over 1,000 years. It's covered in large archaeological, what we call shell midden, again, this refuge of people living in coastal environments, and houses and house structures. For 150 years, or over 150 years, it was no longer in the possession of the Wiyot, and things like industrial ship repair was conducted on the island. And this island sort of transitioned over to Euro-American control in February 1860, when a tragic event occurred. And this is sort of, many of these events happened, unfortunately, in California. And there was a conflict and a massacre by Europeans of mostly Wiyot women and children on the island, who were performing their most important ceremony of the year, the World Renewal Ceremony, where the world was set right. Indian Island is an important place for the Wiyot, because for 1,000 years, this is the place where these important ceremonies were conducted. Well, in 2018, the Eureka City Council voted unanimously for the first time to this scale ever to return a property, Indian Island, to the Wiyot people. So traditional Wiyot dances can continue. The World Renewal Ceremony can once again take place on these traditional tribal lands. And here's a picture of some Wiyot tribal members in ceremonial dance regalia to mark those celebrations. So thank you so much. I'm happy to answer any questions that I can.
Thanks, Todd. First off, I want to mention that there are a few Academy folks in the chat, and they all want to say hi to you.
Great, thank you. Hi.
So they're saying hi. We have time for a few questions. So the first one is about the bear-shaped crescent you first showed. How were crescents used, and how can you tell?
So we have, there's been hundreds of these crescents found throughout California in the Great Basin, so sort of interior regions of Oregon, Nevada, in these and associated with these sort of freshwater lakes. So we not only find crescents, when we find crescents, when we're lucky, we find them within archaeological sites, and then everything around it associated with us tells us about its function. And some of these crescents, many of these crescents, are found directly associated with things like goose bones and marine bird bones that gives us a good indication that they were used as sort of a deadly hunting technology for marine bird hunting.
Cool. You mentioned the use of drones, and we were just wondering what are other ways technology has helped the field of archaeology?
Yeah, I mean, there is so much happening in archaeology right now in terms of like emerging technology that really helps our sort of understanding of deep history. So there's a variety of things like using ancient DNA to look at relationships between animals and people through deep time. I can give you one example. Colleagues have used ancient DNA on island foxes to demonstrate that most likely indigenous peoples transported foxes to the Northern Channel Islands somewhere around 7,000 years ago, where, 10, 15 years ago, we believe that they were sort of a natural part of that landscape. Mm-hmm. They rafted out during storm events sort of naturally, but in fact, it's human. So we do other things like use isotopes of carbon and nitrogen and sort of these chemical approaches to reconstruct diets through time, look at relationships and changes in food webs and how humans have interacted with that. We use satellite technology to do large-scale mapping. Folks have found new Mayan temples in the middle of the jungle through using LiDAR technology, which is basically this mapping from airplanes or satellites. It's just really incredible.
Cool. And I think we have time for one last question. This is about the shell mounds in the Bay Area. Do you know if they're protected now?
The ones that remain are, most of them unfortunately are gone, have been destroyed as sort of San Francisco was built up after the gold rush. And unfortunately, the products in shell middens, the shell was used for sort of line purposes, construction purposes, to build many of the early roads and infrastructure of San Francisco. So many have been lost, but what remains, the remnants of what remains, are protected, and those are protected by very stringent federal and state laws. And archaeologists and many resource managers work really hard to make sure that we're protecting those as sort of non-renewable resources of human history.
Cool. And actually, one last question came in. Do you know how we can help or support the creation of the monument?
I don't. There are Ohlone tribal members. They have great websites set up that are advocating for this. And you can sort of do some Google searches and find them, mm-hmm. and I'm sure they would love support. They, in fact, I'm not a Bay Area archaeologist, but they have been doing yearly sort of gatherings and celebrations where everyone's welcome to come and support. And they are welcoming celebrations to celebrate Ohlone history rather than divisive gatherings that may not feel safe. These are safe places to celebrate cultural history and advocate for it. So they're doing a great job.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Todd. That was fascinating.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Jonathan Rosa. I'm a faculty member at Stanford University in the Graduate School of Education, the Center for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity, and the departments of Anthropology and Linguistics. I'm a linguistic anthropologist by training, and this evening I'll try to convince you all that linguistic anthropology isn't just a powerful tool for analyzing language and culture, but it also is a key strategy for participating in social justice struggles. So to start off, I'll just kind of frame the structure of my presentation. I'll begin by tracking a range of stereotypes about alleged language problems across a range of contexts. I'll then show you how my research takes place in communities on the ground, and I'll conclude by suggesting that we can connect these struggles over language to broader political struggles. So I often like to open my presentations with a cartoon like this, which I think invokes a lot of popular stereotypes about language and identity. It displays a stereotypical representation of a teacher based on racial and gender stereotypes. And it says, I don't judge people based on race, creed, color, or gender. I judge people based on spelling, grammar, punctuation, and sentence structure. And so it's intended to be humorous, and it suggests that you can separate language from identity. But in fact, what we know is that stereotypes about spelling, grammar, punctuation, and sentence structure are often sites for the reproduction of stigmatizing views of race, class, and gender. And so I want to think about how language and identity get intertwined in powerful ways, and how the reproduction of stigmatization can take place through ideas about language. Many scholars and other thinkers have helped us to understand these phenomena. For example, Chicana lesbian feminist philosopher Gloria Anzaldúa suggested, if you really want to hurt me, talk badly about my language. Ethnic identity is twin skin to linguistic identity. I am my language. So Anzaldúa rejects this idea that you can separate language from identity. And I'm really interested in how language and identity get intertwined across a range of institutional settings. A lot of my research focuses primarily on educational settings. And when I enter schools and introduce myself as a linguistic anthropologist, school administrators often say, oh, this is great. We have a lot of language problems, language learning problems that we need to work on in this space. And I always feel compelled to suggest that, well, language isn't a problem for humans historically. So to the extent that you experience it as a problem in your school, that tells us much more about this institution and this society than it does about language. Of course, multilingualism has been a norm throughout human history. So the idea that we imagine monolingualism to be a norm in the United States is quite a strange phenomenon. And I'm interested in how monolingualism has come to be imagined as a norm, and how language, this fundamentally human practice, has been framed as a problem. So let's look at several alleged language learning problems. One is the alleged problem of certain populations which are framed as lacking language altogether or lacking enough words. So some of you might recognize popular media accounts or have encountered popular media accounts that suggest that particular families and households and communities suffer from a so-called word gap or language gap, or a 30 million word gap. This claim is based on the studies of educational psychologists, note not linguistic anthropologists, who suggest that kids from lower income homes hear 30 million fewer words by the age of 3 than kids from wealthier homes, and that this then predicts their eventual educational underachievement. And you see this framed here as a socioeconomic stratification in terms of professional homes, working class homes, and welfare homes. But in fact, all of the so-called welfare homes in this study were African-American and Latino households. And so I'm interested in how stereotypes about race and ethnicity are disguised in relation to ideas about language and class. And you see this not just in in conservative media accounts, but also progressive media, the New York Times, this is if you think the New York Times is progressive, the Washington Post, the Obama administration sponsored language gap programs, the Clinton Foundation has sponsored language gap studies. To be clear, from a linguistic anthropological perspective, low-income households and communities are facing a range of challenges. A lack of words is not the fundamental challenge that they're facing. And it's quite troublesome, the suggestion that if particular households would just learn enough words or learn enough language, that all of these structural issues, the structure of the economy and the structure of a society that distributes access to opportunities and resources in profoundly inequitable ways, that would transform if you learned enough language. So in some cases, the suggestion is you just need to learn more language in general or more words. In other situations, the suggestion is that the problem is that you lack the right language, which in the United States is framed as the English language. And we see this in particular kinds of policies that have been enacted here in California. For example, Proposition 227 in 1998 banned bilingual education across the state. And that was overturned in 2016 through Proposition 58, which allowed for bilingual education programming to be implemented again. Now, what's interesting about Proposition 58, which many people regarded as the silver lining of the 2016 election, I'm interested in even the name of this proposition, California Non-English Languages Allowed in Public Education Act. So we're not even naming any specific languages. We're not casting a vision or conceptualizing a vision for dynamic multilingual education. It's just that languages other than English are allowed to exist. I find that to be quite a sad vision of the kind of world and society that we might want to live in. And you see the results of the stigmatization of bilingualism and bilingual education in a range of settings. So for example, this media report suggests in Los Angeles Unified School District, for instance, the LA Times reported that 6,800 children were classified as non-nons and said to be nonverbal in both English and their native language. To be clear, virtually no human child is a non-non, and yet this doesn't prevent mainstream institutions such as schools from designating kids as such in ways that then prevent those children from accessing a range of educational learning opportunities. And so the question is, why is bilingualism framed as a problem? And why is it framed as a handicap to overcome? And this demonstrates how stereotypes about ability and disability, stereotypes about language and race get intertwined with one another. So in some situations, the problem is framed as a matter of lacking language or words altogether. In other cases, it's that you lack the right language. And in other cases, it's that you lack the right variety of the right language. And I hope you can kind of see the Goldilocks nature of how the bar continually shifts so that it's never enough language for particular populations. And I really want to think about what we could be up to if we rejected these problems. So the suggestion for some populations is that they lack so-called standard English. And you see the implementation of screeners like this that are targeting very specific populations. So for example, this is a screener used in Los Angeles Unified Schools to track the language use of African-American children and to correct the language use of African-American children. So you might see number 17 here. The so-called standard English prompt is she uses a pen to write. The so-called African-American response is pin. So an African-American child might allegedly pronounce pen as pin, which is framed as a problem of vowel pairs and homophones. To be clear, vowel pairs and homophones exist across virtually all human language varieties, completely common. You know, you might be familiar with examples like aunt and aunt, coffee and coffee. Those aren't framed as a problem for millions of people in the United States and throughout the world, and yet they're used against African-American children and framed as a rationalization for the remediation or intervention into the language practices of African-American kids. This is the Mexican-American screener. Number one, don't be bad. A Mexican-American child might allegedly pronounce as don't be bad, which is circumflex or sing-song musical intonation. So here the problem is that Mexican-American kids sound like they're singing when they're speaking, and their intonation needs to be flattened out. Look at number 16, THE, apple, which a Mexican-American child might allegedly produce as the apple. And I'm not sure whether you all are familiar with this rule, but allegedly you're supposed to pronounce THE as the before a word that starts with a vowel. So it should be the apple, not the apple. So I have a PhD in linguistic anthropology, and that is not a rule that I have that I encountered in my educational experience. And yet this is used again against Mexican-American kids. And so I want to think about how these stereotypes about language are rationalizations for the reproduction of inequality. And the goal isn't just to kind of recognize these alleged problems and to challenge them, but to document them in practice and to try to create a vision for a different kind of approach to education and a different kind of world. So I'll show you what this looks like in my work on the ground with communities. So one community I work closely with is in Western Massachusetts. It's called Holyoke. It is a community that's predominantly Puerto Rican. It has one of the highest concentrations of Puerto Ricans in the United States. And that high concentration of Puerto Ricans in Holyoke is often associated with high rates of educational underachievement. So if you look at this chart all the way to the right, 87% of Holyoke students scored below proficient in the statewide assessment, by far the highest rate of underachievement in the state of Massachusetts. And this is often rationalized in relation to language. So this media report suggests Holyoke, again, was among the lowest in the state, despite a high school graduation rate that improved slightly to 53.8% from the previous year's 52.8%. The city of 40,000 is roughly half Hispanic. Among challenges officials have said is that English is not the first language for more than 70% of public school students. So here you see a language other than English, in this case Spanish, framed as an explanation for underachievement and educational challenges more broadly. And the question is, how is it that language is scapegoated as the explanation or rationalization for underachievement, rather than a whole range of societal and structural issues? Access to a living wage and stable employment, access to stable housing, access to healthy food and healthcare, access to political representation. None of these issues are framed as the cause of educational challenges. Instead, language is framed as the quick fix. And I'm interested in how this definition of language as a quick fix lets the state and the government and us collectively off the hook and frames educational challenges as issues that can be addressed in a household or that are the fault of families and parents rather than the fault of a society more broadly. So Holyoke residents internalize these ideas about the stigmatization of the Spanish language. One poet suggested that the city is allergic to Spanish altogether, but it turns out that the city is not allergic to Spanish because the young, charismatic, Irish-American white mayor, Alex Morse, is bilingual in English and Spanish. He ran a bilingual campaign, and his bilingualism is often celebrated in popular media. So I think it's great that he's bilingual. The question is, why is his bilingualism celebrated and championed, whereas Holyoke's Puerto Rican residents' bilingualism, their Spanish and English bilingualism, is framed as a problem to be overcome? So in order to understand these issues, I worked with my students. I was teaching at the time at the University of Massachusetts. So I worked with a group of undergraduate students and a group of Holyoke High School students. I partnered with a Spanish teacher at Holyoke High School to train all of our students to conduct, as linguistic anthropologists, to conduct research on these issues and these stereotypes about language. Some students studied oral histories, so families' migration to the city. Other students studied language use across the community and social media platforms and vernacular or slang use, language use throughout the city and its landscape. They studied the ban on bilingual education in Massachusetts and the policy that went into that, the voting patterns. And others studied community-based language use in ethnographies of churches, of barbershops, of commercial spaces as well. So I'll just show you a couple of examples from this research and then I'll wrap up. The students who conducted oral history interviews found incredibly fascinating data. Almost all of these interviews came back asymmetrically bilingual, where the students would speak English and their families or parents would speak Spanish. So here's one student, Darian, a 10th grader, interviewing his mother. English subtitles are under the Spanish here. The brackets signal overlapping speech, and the equal signs signal interruption. And prepare yourself, because Darian is particularly exuberant. I'm sorry, it looks like you might not have been able to hear that, so I'm going to play that again.
What's your primary language? Mi lenguaje primario es inglés. Pero can you elaborate on that? Like, es que yo hablo inglés porque en la escuela yo hablo inglés. Oh, when you were younger. Con mi amigo yo hablo inglés, pero con mi familia yo hablo en español. That's good, Mom.
So first of all, I love that this young student initially asks her to elaborate on that, and then he wants to quickly wrap up the interview. But what's fascinating here is that he asks her what her primary language is in English. She responds in Spanish and explains that her primary language is English. And so this might seem like a contradictory practice from many perspectives, but then she goes on to explain how she uses Spanish with family and English in a range of other settings. And this is a completely normative behavior across a range of spaces. So the question is, how is it that these kinds of practices are framed as problems in schools? And what if our schools were built alongside and with communities in ways that correspond to communities' everyday practices? The students who studied the linguistic landscape found that functional information, like these welcome signs in the school, were provided in English and Spanish. They found that privileged information focused on applying for scholarships and applying to college and to take the SATs was exclusively in English. And they found that punitive information, like these no loitering signs that stood in front of the school, were exclusively in Spanish and in highly non-standardized Spanish. So this is a play on the slang verb hanguear, so no hanging out, essentially. And it's a coded message that's directed at very particular populations and not others. And so this disparate invocation of the Spanish language and of multilingualism is something that we were documenting. But the goal wasn't just to recognize inequality, it was to speak back to it. So we participated in the creation of a Puerto Rican studies program, of a Latino or Latinx educational advisory for Holyoke teachers and administrators. And we really wanted to collaborate to speak back to these realities and to create a new vision for education in Holyoke. This is part of broader work that I'm doing with communities across a range of spaces, like Humboldt Park in Chicago, as part of a community as a campus initiative, to really challenge the idea that marginalized communities are spaces of lack or are deficient spaces, and instead to recognize the profound knowledge that exists within these spaces. These are intellectual contexts where people understand the problems they're facing and are pushing back against them. And in conclusion, the goal of all of this is to connect these struggles over language learning to broader political struggles. We might think about struggles over immigration reform and ideas about illegality, ideas about foreign languages in the United States. And we use these struggles over language to reject the notion that any human being is illegal anywhere in the United States or on planet Earth. But the goal isn't just to assert or to challenge illegality and to champion citizenship, because we want to work with a broader set of political struggles like Black Lives Matter, which recognize this very clearly, that you can have US citizenship or be positioned as a citizen and yet still be disposable, still face second, third, and fourth class citizenship. We also want to be careful about celebrating the notion that the United States is a so-called nation of immigrants, which obscures indigenous genocide and indigenous dispossession and ongoing indigenous survivance and political struggles in the United States, efforts towards decolonization like the anti-Dakota Access Pipeline movement. So the idea is to connect these language learning struggles to much broader political struggles, to rethink the kind of world that we want to live in, a world that leads us to reimagine political, linguistic, and ethno-racial borders. And I'll leave it there. If you're interested in reading more about this, these are a couple of books that I have worked on, and I welcome you to engage with them. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. That was so interesting. We have time for a few questions. The first one is, you showed the screening tool, and we just had questions on what that was used for.
That was used in Los Angeles Unified School District for kids of color, essentially. So Mexican American kids and African American kids, and there's a Hawaiian American screener as well to correct their so-called English standard, lack of so-called standard English. And so kids who are framed as suffering from language learning deficiencies, these screeners are tools that are used to help them. But the helping hand strikes again in these ways that actually reproduce stigmatization.
Yeah, interesting. Kind of along the lines with LA Unified School District, we had a question on what is the perceived motivation of LAUSD, or anyone for that matter, for designating students as non-non when they are presumably not?
Well, schools are working in relation to broader policies. So policies at the local level, at the state level, and the national level, which stigmatize languages other than English systematically in the United States to promote monolingual norms for very particular populations. So bilingualism is celebrated for some people, but not for others. And so I think what happens in mainstream schools is these policies are reproducing these forms of marginalization and these stigmatizing views. And so often people understand themselves as helping. And so the language gap study, by efforts towards bilingual education, or even the standard English screeners, people understand themselves to be assisting. But you end up with situations where self-identified monolingual teachers, administrators, and elected officials are helping multilingual students, families, and communities. And so how is it that people who are identified as monolingual understand themselves to be helping multilingual people with their language use? That's an upside down reality, but that's the reality we live in right now.
Yeah. So these are kind of two related questions. Do you consider nonverbal language in your studies? And then kind of a related one was, how does code switching fit into like the framework?
Oh, these are two fantastic questions. So I think of spoken language and written language and sign languages as absolutely fundamental to human communication. And it's important not to just isolate what we think of as stereotypical language use as written language or spoken language, but to rather analyze a whole range of signs and symbols. So I study graffiti, hairstyles, clothing. I'm interested in all symbolic practices, and I understand them as communicative or semiotic practices, as linguistic practices. Code switching is a really interesting topic to me. I'm interested in different definitions of code switching. On the one hand, I'm fascinated in ideas about code switching that are used to understand the strategies that marginalized populations develop in order to navigate different settings in which their language practices are stigmatized. And so very particular populations feel the need to navigate these spaces strategically. In other ways, I want us to attend to how code switching is actually, in many ways, a universal practice. So everyone is engaging in language practices that shift according to context, but we only police and notice very particular populations' language shifts. And I want us to think really critically about why that is, that only particular populations' practices come under surveillance in this way. And I want to suggest that by attending to all of the linguistic diversity that's all around us, we could recognize many possibilities for the kind of world that we might want to live in.
Yeah. Cool. We have time for one last question. Could social media affect language acquisition and expression negatively in the long term?
This is an interesting question. I don't like to make generalizing statements about what a given technology might do. So note that anytime historically a technology has emerged, newspapers, the radio, television, social media, there's often a public anxiety about the downfall of culture in relation to these sorts of technologies. And what we find is that they function in many different ways. And so they require us to engage in careful study. So that's why I've written about Twitter before, but we have to, and various social media platforms, we have to analyze all of the different ways that different populations are engaging with these platforms strategically in ways that might in fact be troublesome, but in other ways that might serve as tools
for social justice struggles. So I've written about how Twitter has been used by activists to share information that mainstream media don't necessarily cover. So for example, in Ferguson, Missouri, the role of Twitter was central to a lot of protest in that context, and I've written about that. So I'm interested in social media in these spaces as sites of possibility and sites of challenges potentially as well.
Yeah, fascinating. Thank you so much, Jonathan. I think we'll bring up Christina and we'll sign out for the night, but thanks again.
Thank you.
Hi.
Well, thanks everyone for tuning in tonight, and special thanks to Cheryl, Todd, Nikki, and Jonathan for presenting. It was really, really interesting. I know I learned a lot. Next week, we're going to be going virtual bird watching along the coast. So tune in to learn more about brown pelicans, snowy plovers, and other seabirds.
Yeah, and thank you to all of you who are sharing stories in the comments during Dr. Rosa's presentation. Yeah, it's really great to see how close, his presentation is hitting with so many people. And so we encourage you to follow him on Twitter and look more into that. But anyway, the Academy is still closed. But thank you so much for joining us for these night schools, whether this is your 20th episode, because that could happen, or your first. If you have the means, we would love any donation. There's a link to the Academy's Resilience Fund in the YouTube description. And so any amount helps until we get our doors back open again. And yeah, just be sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss a night school or any other Academy live stream like the Breakfast Club series. And yeah, thank you so much. This was a really special night. So thanks for joining us. Good night. Bye, Lynn.
Bye.